Hi, my name is Emily Kile, and I am just absolutely thrilled to have with us Nicole Matthews from SARC. I love SARC. I'm very involved in their committees, education committee and their plan giving committee. They're just an amazing organization and resource that we have here in town. So I'm just thrilled to have Nicole here so she can give us kind of an update and information about what happens beyond adulthood for those of you who have a loved one who may have autism or somebody that you know in somebody else's family. And so with that, Nicole, I'll let you introduce yourself and thank you for giving us some of your time. For the participants, if you have some questions, just put them in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll both be kind of keeping our eye on that as time goes on. And if there's time at the end and your questions weren't answered, we'll be sure to try to get to those. So thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Right. Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am excited to be here. I am the Director of Research at SARC. For those of you who might not be familiar, SARC is the Southwest Autism Research and Resource Center, and we are a nonprofit organization that was established more than 25 years ago. We have a large clinical services program that provides services and support to people with autism throughout the lifespan. And we also have a research department, which I am a part of, and we do a lot of interesting work also throughout the lifespan. So today I'll be sharing a little bit of that. I've actually spent the majority of my professional career at SARC. I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary with the organization, and I started here as a postdoctoral researcher. What attracted me to SARC was the focus on lifespan development. We know that development doesn't stop in childhood and that children with autism become adults with autism. And that was a major research interest for me, and I have been allowed to pursue lines of research related to both the transition to adulthood and aging in autism. And so today I'm going to give a little bit of background about that with a focus on a project that we just recently finished. The project was to develop a novel program for autistic adults of all ages, which is pretty unique because the majority of services and supports stop around young adulthood. So I won't get too far into my presentation before acknowledging my collaborators. Let me go ahead and see, is this going to work? There we go. So this is our study team for the project. I was lucky to join an existing team of Dr. Blair Braden. She is at Arizona State University, an associate professor there and the director of the Autism Brain Aging Lab. Also Dr. Leslie Baxter, a clinical neuropsychologist, at Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and then our chief science officer at SARC, Dr. Christopher Smith. They were already conducting a longitudinal study of aging and autism, where they were collecting both behavioral data and neuroimaging data with a focus on cognitive aging. It was one of the first of its kind studies. And what I'm going to talk about today was really inspired by that, both in their data and through their personal interactions with participants. I also want to acknowledge the other members of our study team listed on this slide and our funding source, so the Department of Defense Autism Research Program, and they funded the 3-year project that I'll be talking about today. So I'm sure if you're on this webinar, you have an interest in autism, you probably have some familiarity with it. To make sure that we're all on the same page, I wanted to start by defining it. So autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It is characterized by challenges with social communication and restricted and repetitive behaviors. And also differences in these areas must be present in the early childhood period, so basically before school age. Currently, prevalence rates 1 in 36 of American children are estimated to have autism or believed to have autism, and this prevalence rate has been growing over the years. So when I first started in the field about 15 years ago, it was at 1 in 150. And we believe that this is due to better identification. Also important for this talk is that the majority of autistic individuals have a co-occurring mental health condition, and co-occurring physical health conditions are more likely in autistic individuals, and this persists throughout the lifespan. So it indicates the need for ongoing supports for people on the spectrum. You may also be aware that autism is heterogeneous. So you may have heard someone say that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that's because the presentation of these core symptoms that I talked about on the previous slide can look really different from person to person, ranging from an individual who may not have any speech and they may have an intellectual disability, to people who are verbally fluent, who may have a very high IQ and may be employed competitively and successful in their career. So people with autism can have an intellectual disability, many do not. And we see a lot of individual differences in adaptive functioning. So these are the skills that you need to live independently, even in individuals who don't have an intellectual disability. So to qualify for a diagnosis of autism, you have to demonstrate some sort of functional impairment at some point in your life. And so that is required as a part of the diagnosis. But we do see a lot of variability in that. So getting into the topic of this presentation, as I mentioned before, children with autism become adults with autism. So they transition to adulthood. Unfortunately, we still know very little about both what that looks like and what happens in middle and late adulthood. So really, it's been in the last 10 years that our field has even started researching this, and it makes sense. Relatively speaking, autism is a new disorder, and the first cohorts of people who were diagnosed with autism are just now reaching those later periods of life. And so we just haven't had the population to draw from in order to study aging and autism. But recently, Patricia Howland, who's a leader in the field of aging and autism, and one of her collaborators, they conducted a review of what autism looks like in adulthood that I'm going to summarize for you here. So in terms of social outcomes, although there is a variety of outcomes, a wide variety, the majority of people with autism are dependent on others for their care. Also, many are disadvantaged economically, educationally, so they might face challenges pursuing and completing both their high school degree and post-high school, post-secondary degrees, even compared to others with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities. And there is also poor self-reported quality of life among individuals who are more verbally fluent, who might not have that intellectual disability. They also identified factors related to outcome. So individuals who had higher verbal abilities and who were not intellectually disabled had better outcomes than individuals who had lower verbal abilities and did have an intellectual disability in childhood. But they really highlighted this high variability of outcomes, even among those who had high verbal abilities and were not intellectually disabled. So it's not the case that just because someone does not have an intellectual disability means that they are going to not have any issues in adulthood. For some, maybe, but for a lot of individuals, they still require continued support or want continued support. Regarding mental health, there's inconsistency here in methods, which makes it really hard to summarize and to come up with accurate estimates of how many individuals on the spectrum are impacted by other mental health conditions. But there is a signal coming from these findings, meaning that it's pretty clear that people with autism, they are experiencing co-occurring mental health disorders at a higher rate than people who do not have autism. And anxiety and depression symptoms tend to be the most common. And last, they talked about mortality and aging. So there are higher rates of medical conditions, so physical health conditions, and mortality in autism. Epilepsy is the most common cause of death based on the research that has been conducted. And also there's an elevated risk of suicide in autism, although again, the data collection methods have been inconsistent. And so it's tough to really understand who within the autism population is most at risk for suicide. Our group, so the collaborators I talked about earlier, they have had a focus on cognitive aging and autism. And again, like all these other areas, the research is very preliminary. There's not a lot of work here. There's inconsistency in methods. A lot of the research has focused on what are called cross-sectional study designs, meaning that they're comparing people at different points in the lifespan to each other. So in 2023, they're comparing a 20-year-old who's 20 in 2023 to a 60-year-old who's 60 in 2023. And there are just so many differences in those people's experiences, likely differences in the presentation of their autism. So someone who is in our study who's diagnosed or who's in our study as a 60-year-old adult is likely to be diagnosed in adulthood, which is much different from a person who is diagnosed at age 3. Their symptoms are likely differing in terms of severity. And so it's hard to draw conclusions from cross-sectional studies. And very few studies involve people who are over the age of 60 because of what I mentioned before. The first cohorts of people diagnosed with autism are just now aging into later adulthood. There's mixed findings in this area. So some research suggests that autistic adults, they age cognitively in a parallel fashion to the general population. So that means that we know that the general population experiences cognitive decline as they age, and that autistic adults experience that same cognitive decline. It's not at all more severe. But there's also some evidence to suggest accelerated trajectories of aging in autistic adults, actually coming from our own group. There's also some research to suggest that autistic adults are at a higher risk for neurodegenerative disorders, including early onset dementia, and that autistic adults continue to experience executive dysfunction throughout adulthood. So the takeaways from the limited research that we currently have, first of all, identifying and establishing supports prior to the age of 18, if possible, is really desirable. Because if individuals qualify for services in childhood, they're more likely to qualify for services in adulthood. That being said, a lot of autistic individuals and their family members report this services cliff that they experience as they transition to adulthood, meaning that they go from having potentially a lot of services, educational, therapeutic services, and then once they exit high school, a lot of those disappear. So there really is a need for additional services in adulthood. And the literature suggests that the areas that these services should target include strategies for managing cognitive challenges that we know exist in autistic individuals, so executive functioning challenges in particular, and that may potentially protect against these strategies, protect against cognitive decline. So provide some compensatory strategies to help individuals manage decline that they might experience as they age. The literature documents ongoing challenges with social relationships, and then this co-occurring existence of mental health conditions with a focus on internalizing symptoms, so depression and anxiety. Also, a big takeaway is we just need more research, and that will happen, but it's going to take some time. So the rest of this presentation is going to focus on the development of a program that we wanted to develop based on everything I just told you, the lack of supports for people as they age and the ongoing challenges that autistic adults report that they experience. So we developed a program. It's a multi-component program that's focusing on these 3 main areas that we have noticed in the literature and in our own research. So executive functioning, mood dysregulation, so that's being targeted through mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is an evidence-based intervention, and then also social skills or social relationships. As I mentioned before, this was funded by the Department of Defense, started as a 3-year study, but we got funding for it right when COVID started, so it's become a 4-year study, and we're just wrapping it up. So this is the last year of the study. This slide gives a nice summary of the activities that we did through this project. So we had an idea of what we wanted to do with strengthening skills in the three main areas we wanted to focus on, but we wanted to get input from autistic adults and their communities about how we would do this and if there are other areas that we should include. So the first year of the study, we did focus interviews with autistic adults who represented different parts of the lifespan. So 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 50-year-old, and a 60-year-old. And we also asked them to suggest someone from their life, so a family member or a friend, to also be interviewed to get some additional insight into their strengths, their challenges, and their general experiences. And in that first year, we looked at those interviews and the data that we got from them, and we used that data to refine our idea for the program. And we also did this with input from autistic professionals and autistic graduate students in Dr. Braden's lab. In the second and third and now fourth years of the study, we delivered the program. We collected what's called feasibility and acceptability data. So feasibility means, is it possible to deliver a program like this? And then acceptability data is whether or not the population you're delivering the program to finds it to be acceptable intervention, something that they can manage and participate in and find value in. And then last, we have been iteratively refining the program based on feedback from our participants. So that means that every time we finished a group and we got that acceptability data from them, we applied the findings from that data to the program. And so we refined it before we delivered it to our next group of participants. So first, I'm going to go through some of the key points that we got from analyzing those focused interviews. So we used a qualitative analysis approach, which means we're analyzing the responses of participants. So we literally transcribed everything they said, and then we went and we coded their responses word by word to try to get an understanding of what they were trying to tell us and to identify themes across participants. And these are the three main themes that we found. So first, appropriateness of the proposed program. So many of the participants, they endorsed the need for programming for adults. And we did have one participant who had done mindfulness-based intervention before. So this was an autistic individual. And they talked about how they found the program effective, but there were also some limitations for them in terms of using mindfulness strategies to manage their anxiety. So we took this into consideration. We actually, Dr. Braden had done a previous study on mindfulness-based strategies for autistic adults and found some really promising findings. And so we didn't remove this aspect of the program, but we figured we would address it with individualized side meetings with participants who potentially need some additional strategies for managing those internalizing symptoms. And then another important part of this theme was avoiding ableism. So you may have heard that term before. In case you haven't, ableism is essentially discrimination toward people who are less able from the majority who are able. And this is a topic of importance to many autistic adults who perceive a lot of programming and intervention to come from an ableistic perspective. And we wanted to integrate that into the design of the program. We certainly didn't want it to be perceived as ableist. And so we took some time to focus on the language of the program. So for example, just the title, we didn't have a title for the program, but we wanted to make sure it was coming from a strengths-based approach and wasn't sort of focusing on deficits. So that's how we landed on strengthening skills. We also revised the role of the program partners. So in past programs for autistic adults, program partners have been referred to as social coaches or support companions. And we wanted to change that language to remove sort of a power dynamic. And so we landed on program partners, and we actually asked the program partners to do everything that we asked the autistic adults to do. So the program partners set their own goals that they were going to work toward. And instead of coaching the autistic adult, they instead met together and talked about their own progress toward their own goals. And then also an individualization, or sorry, a focus on individualization and choice. So we really wanted participants to be able to choose what parts of their life they were going to focus on in the program, and we didn't want to be telling them what they should be focusing on. The next theme was topics that the program could address. We were very pleased to see that 3 of the main themes were themes that we were already planning to focus on. So internalizing symptoms, social relationships, and executive functioning. Some other things identified by our participants were interpersonal factors, so things like self-determination and self-esteem. And we addressed this through an increased emphasis on choice and self-advocacy in the program. Also, many of our participants discussed how sensory overload is very debilitating and challenging for them. And one way of managing that a participant shared with us is what we call energy accounting. And this is basically taking stock of activities that drain your energy and activities that give you energy, and using that knowledge to plan your daily and your weekly activities. So if there is an activity that you have to do that is very aversive and challenging, making sure that your energy levels are at an optimal place to do that, and planning your days accordingly. We also added a panel on autistic burnout. So this is another term you may have heard. It's relatively new. There is some empirical research that's starting to be done on it, but it's mostly come from communities of autistic adults who are describing this condition or phenomenon, for lack of a better word, where the challenges of socializing and sensory stimulation leads to prolonged exhaustion for them and can cause them to have to withdraw from many of their meaningful daily activities like work or family events. And we had some requests actually from participants in our first group to add additional content on this. So that, combined with these focused interviews, led us to add both a didactic lesson on what is currently known about autistic burnout, and then a panel of autistic adults who shared strategies that they have used in the past to help managing autistic burnout. And what was really cool about that is the strategies they shared were pretty consistent with the strategies that we were already planning to teach in the program. Yes, Emily.
So just a question. So how do you find the folks to participate? You send out a notice that says, hey, we're doing a study. And then my other question is this sitting down with an individual and kind of going through questions that you guys have already developed, and then they respond to those? Can you help us understand kind of how somebody gets there and what that looks like for the individual, in case we have folks who might receive those notices and not understand what the process is going to look like for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Emily, for bringing that up. So we have existing databases both at SARC and at the Autism Brain Aging Lab at ASU of people who have expressed interest in study participation, or they have participated in past studies. And then we also do heavy advertising for most of these studies to try to recruit additional participants. The participants for these focused interviews were participants who were already in the longitudinal aging study that we were conducting with Dr. Braden. And we essentially reached out to participants who were in each of those age groups to see who would be interested in participating. And then the part of the study, or the project that I'm going to talk about in a bit, we recruited both through those databases that I talked about and through really heavy advertising on both of our social media channels. And there's also a resource through Spark, which is from the Simons Foundation. They are a national registry of people with autism diagnoses who want to participate in research. And I know that in some of our previous work, we have worked with them to recruit participants. So we may have also gotten participants from there. But yeah, when you see information about studies posted by SARC, posted by ASU, we're always happy to answer any questions that people have when they call in. You don't have to like guarantee you're going to participate. We'll work with you to see if it's going to be a good fit.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Okay. And then the last theme that we identified through these interviews was strengths and strategies of autistic adults. So these are areas that they identified as strengths in their lives, and then strategies that they have used in the past. So the most striking thing about this was the diversity of strengths identified by individuals. So what was a major strength for someone might have been a major challenge for another participant. And even within the same person, they might have reported a strength in like a broad area of functioning, but then accompanying challenges. So I think the most striking example to me was an autistic adult who said that they were managing all of their bills independently, paying them on time, but at the same time, they were a compulsive overspender, and they were actually in the process of filing for bankruptcy because of that challenge. And so this really supported our planned individualization of the program. So we went into this wanting to be able to provide individualized supports to participants. The other part of this theme that influenced the design of the program was that participants reported the benefits of both receiving informal supports and giving informal supports, and particularly to other autistic adults. So sharing their experience and strategies that have worked for them with other autistic adults and hearing what has worked for other autistic adults. And so we wanted to provide a part of this program that allowed for that opportunity. So in addition to sort of the structured part of the program where we had specific lesson plans and strategies we wanted to talk about, we made sure that there was an opportunity for participants to discuss what had worked for them, what hadn't worked for them, and additional challenges they might be facing, and to hear feedback from other participants in the group. So the findings from those focus interviews, combined with the existing literature, let us basically refine and further develop our idea for the Strengthening Skills program, which is a group-based program. When we first embarked on this, we 100% were planning to do this in person. That's how we wrote the grant proposal, but we received funding for this project. I believe the grant started in April of 2020, and there was no feasible way to move forward doing an in-person program in the time we had to do this project. And so we made the decision to deliver the program through Zoom. That's what a lot of people were doing at the time. And we conducted the meetings in the evenings based on what we heard from our focus group, our focus interview participants, because many of them work. The evenings are really the best time for them to be able to participate. So every Tuesday night at 5:30 is when we jumped in on these meetings. And each week had 3 different parts to the program. There were didactic lessons on the week's topics. There was opportunity for the group to practice the strategies that we were talking about, and then also that group discussion to discuss other strategies or challenges they might be facing. Something I don't have on this slide is we did individualized side meetings with participants to help individualize the program. And so we offered these to everyone. We did them with everyone. Some participants took more advantage of them than others, but they're basically like 15 to 20-minute Zoom meetings where we talked about their individualized goals. We also made handouts of each topic available online. This started out through a website, but the use of the website was variable. And so we actually began emailing the handouts to all of our participants each week. But we did have that website for participants to go access the resources. There were interactive to-do lists that they could use on the website and videos that sort of oriented them to the materials for that week. So a little bit more on the topics that we covered. There are these 3 main areas that I mentioned earlier. So first, executive skills. The strategies for this program were actually adapted from a program that was developed for adults with mild cognitive impairment, so aging adults with mild cognitive impairment. And it takes a compensatory approach, so providing compensatory strategies to deal with challenges in executive functioning. And when I say executive functioning, I mean things like time management, organization, being able to stop a task that you're really interested in, to prioritize a task that you might be less interested in but needs to be completed. And much of this was focused on habit formation, so developing habits to just make life easier, essentially. Participants were asked to identify an area of their life that they were having challenges with, to develop a habit to help them in that area. And I'll give some examples of that in a little bit. But other topics covered in this component were time management and procrastination, energy accounting, which I talked about earlier. We had those didactics and the panel on autistic burnout. Effective communication was something that was identified by participants, in particular between autistic adults and their program partners. So strategies for that. We also talked a lot about sleep habits, just because sleep is incredibly important and many autistic individuals experience sleep challenges. And then finances were identified by every single one of our focused group or focus interview participants. And so we added a didactic on that. So to give you an idea of how we taught habit formation, we wanted to develop brief, easy to follow steps. So participants were asked to identify something that was interfering with their quality of life. Some people actually chose mindfulness for this. Their stress, their anxiety, their depression was interfering with their quality of life. And so they wanted to develop a mindfulness habit. And so that's what they focused on. Other individuals wanted to improve their physical health through exercise or eating. So they chose that. We had some individuals choose just managing all of the paperwork in their house that had piled up and had become almost like hoarding situation. So there was a real variety of areas that participants chose to focus on. And then we helped them to break down the task into small steps so that they could focus on making small, slow progress toward achieving their goals. We encourage them to have a backup plan for if this strategy that they're putting together didn't work, because things happen in life, and really normalizing that it's not unusual for someone to not achieve a goal on the first try. And then we encourage them to track their progress, which we found really important, because oftentimes we would check in with them the next week to see how things were going, and they would report, oh, I did terribly this week. And then when we dug in a little bit and got details, they actually were making pretty good progress toward their goal. And so it was really important that they were tracking their progress so that we could have those conversations. We focused on anchoring new habits to existing habits. So this is a common concept in the behavioral economics field. And the idea here is it's easier to develop a habit if you anchor it or piggyback it onto something that you're already doing. So me, for example, I have developed a habit of doing mindfulness meditation every morning. And the way I did that was I anchored it to brushing my teeth. So as soon as I brush my teeth in the morning, I go out and I do my 10-minute mindfulness meditation. And the idea here is it just increases the likelihood that you're going to remember to do your new habit. We also had a lot of discussion about intrinsic motivation for developing these new habits. So how could their quality of life be better if they were to address some of these challenges that they were experiencing? The mindfulness component of the program was adapted from an evidence-based program called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so we did in-group practice of meditation. They also had out-group home practice that we asked them to do, and then didactic lessons on many of the key concepts of mindfulness. If you're not familiar with mindfulness, it's basically multiple different strategies to cultivate being in the present moment so that you are not experiencing anxiety about things that have happened in the past or in the future. And then the last part of the program was what we call deconstructing social interactions. This was actually adapted from an existing evidence-based social skills program for autistic young adults. So it's one of the only evidence-based programs for adults. Notice it's focused on young adults, so we needed to adapt it to be a little bit more relevant to older participants. But the lessons focus on deconstructing social interactions to try to understand why people do what they do, strategies for managing when you don't necessarily understand social cues other people are giving you. The program includes role plays to demonstrate some of the strategies that we talk about, opportunities to practice in the group, and then homework assignments. So homework assignments could be something like identifying a social group that you might want to join if your goal is to make new friends. Or it could be an in-group phone call to another person in the group to have a conversation with them and practice some of the reciprocal conversation skills that we were talking about. We made some other modifications based on participant feedback throughout the group. So this wasn't necessarily based on the focus interviews, but this was from acceptability data that we got from participants who actually went through the program. So that's how we got to the term deconstructing social interactions instead of social skills. So many adults felt that they did not need to learn social skills, but they valued sort of the insight into why people do things they do in different social interactions. We also had to heavily modify the role plays and some of the content from the original program that was developed for young adults. A lot of the feedback we got was that the program felt like it was a little bit, it was targeted toward a younger population. And so after our first group, we sort of went back to the drawing board and revised them to be more relevant. And then last, this was interesting to us. We initially were going to require that participants have a program partner, so someone in their life who would participate with them. And through recruitment for the program and also feedback that we got in those acceptability surveys, it became very clear that it is a challenge for some autistic adults to identify someone in their life who can serve in this role. And so we actually made that optional. So we strongly encouraged a program partner because we thought it would give opportunities to talk about the program outside of the group. But if someone didn't have a program partner that could participate, it was not required. So this is what the study design looked like for the project. So we were doing what's called a hybrid feasibility effectiveness trial, where we were really focused on collecting feasibility and acceptability data, but we wanted to collect some data to understand, are we seeing some indications of effectiveness? But our sample size was much smaller than what we would need to truly test effectiveness of the program. So we compared the strengthening skills program, which had those 3 components I just talked about, to a group of participants who completed only the P.L.C program. So it was adapted for older adults, but it was just the social skills part of the program because we wanted to see if this multi-component program had some added benefit to one of the only existing evidence-based programs for autistic adults. So our goals were to evaluate feasibility and acceptability, and then also to explore that pilot effectiveness data. And so we asked participants at this before going into the program and after completing the program to complete questionnaires on their quality of life, on their adaptive functioning, which are those skills that you need to live independently, and on mood symptoms. So although we were comparing 2 programs, we had 3 study groups that participants were randomly assigned to. So there was that strengthening skills group, the P.L.C group, and then what is called a delayed treatment control group. So this is a group of participants who they participate in data collection at baseline, and then they have a wait period of 16 weeks before they go through the program so that we can see what happens just with natural development, natural maturation when people are not in a program. The participants ranged in age from 21 to 73 years. Our average age was around 41 years. We had 14 participants in each group. And the 2 programs were 16 weeks. They met once a week, and this was modeled after the existing P.L.C program. The P.L.C program met for an hour and a half, and then the strengthening skills program, because it was sort of this head-to-head comparison, it had to be long. So it was a 3-hour program that included the social skills components from P.L.C, but also the executive skills and mindfulness components of the program. So talking about feasibility, I want to start with a disclaimer that this was conducted during COVID, and actually our second cohort was in the height of the Omicron variant, where lots of people were. And while we were protected from, spreading the virus by being on Zoom, it didn't mean that our participants weren't affected by the stress and potential illness that came with that. So the strengthening skills program actually had a relatively high rate of dropout. 36% of our participants did drop out, and the reasons are on the slide. Whereas our P.L.C program participants were incredibly dedicated. They really stuck with it. So we only had a 14% dropout, which was actually lower than our delayed treatment control group. And we are interpreting this that is likely due to the length of strengthening skills, which has since been refined. So we have refined it down to a 2-hour program, but also there were some unavoidable health issues and circumstances that were likely confounded by the pandemic in both groups. Regarding acceptability, so participants completed acceptability surveys at the end of their participation in the program. They were asked to rate items like the ones you see on the screen. So I would suggest this program to other autistic adults, or goals of the program were important for my functioning at home and in the community. And they rated that using a 7-point Likert scale. So ranging from 1, I strongly disagree with this statement, to 7, I strongly agree with the statement. And as you can see, I'm not sure if you guys can see my pointer, but down toward the bottom of the slide, the averages for the 2 groups are listed, and the strengthening skills participants actually rated it as significantly more acceptable than the peers participants, although both groups that have relatively high acceptability scores. So really anything over 5 suggests that it is an acceptable program to the participants. In addition to those items that we asked them to rate, we collected qualitative data. So we asked participants to discuss or to write in their responses the strengths of the program, limitations of the program, and suggestions for improving the program. We collected this from both strengthening skills and peers participants. And what you see on the screen on the left are the themes from the qualitative analysis that we did on those responses. And on the right, it describes whether or not that theme was observed in both groups or just one of the groups, So overall, participants said that this was a positive experience for them. They also talked about how it was really valuable for them to connect to other group members who were also autistic, and that contributed to their understanding of autism and autistic identity. In both groups, there was gratitude for that interpersonal understanding and clarity. Our peers group participants did desire additional discussion of autistic identity, which is not at all covered in the peers program. So that could be why the strengthening skills program was rated as more acceptable to participants. A theme of valuing individualization was also. So our participants in the strengthening skills program loved the individualized side meetings. They really liked that opportunity to get one-on-one feedback and discussion with the group leaders. And what's interesting is that in the peers program, many of the program partners actually said it would be great if there could be some increased individualization. So that's really informative for programs moving forward. Participants in both groups talked about the approaches being helpful, and both groups identified limitations. So in strengthening skills, the program website was identified as a limitation. Participants just didn't like having to go there, which is why we ended up starting emailing all of the materials to them. And also a lot about session length and duration. So again, this informed our refinement of the program. 3 hours is too long for anyone to be sitting in a Zoom meeting. And then in peers, some of the participants talked about how the program was adding additional stress and exhaustion to their lives. And then also there were a number of recommendations for additional content, a lot of which was consistent with the content in the strengthening skills program, which is pretty interesting. So it seems like the addition of emotion regulation strategies and executive functioning strategies in strengthening skills was really sort of bridging that gap for participants. And then last, there were some comments about the program audience. So our strengthening skills participants said that anyone could really benefit for the program. They spoke about needing to be ready for the program, which is informative for intake for future iterations of the program. And then also we had some program partners that felt that if possible, it would be really great if everyone could have a program partner. So I have a little bit to share about our pilot effectiveness data. I'll remind you that that was not the main. Our sample size was way too small to be able to really detect many statistically significant findings. But what we did see in both the peers and strengthening skills group, we saw improvements in social functioning on one of the self-report measures relative to the delayed treatment control group. And these were large effects for both groups. So that really suggests that that social relationships program that is evidence-based for younger adults is still effective in adults of all ages. We also saw increases on the conceptual domain of our adaptive functioning measure for our strengthening skills group. And what's interesting there, sorry about that, is that that domain looks at communication and self-direction, which are components of the program that we focused on. And then last, we saw an increase in psychological quality of life in the strengthening skills program relative to the delayed control group. And this was a large effect. And so we're thinking that this is likely due to those mindfulness-based strategies for managing internalizing symptoms. So some take-home thoughts. We developed a multi-component program, Strengthening Skills, that's personalized to the participant. And we focus on breaking down tasks, appreciating accomplishments as we go, and focusing on quality of life as a motivator. There were design constraints that made the program overly long for everyone involved. But despite that, feasibility and acceptability of the program were still rated higher by participants in strengthening skills than participants and peers. And we're seeing some promising evidence in our exploratory endpoints looking at pilot effectiveness of the program. In terms of future direction, so we have revised the protocol for strengthening skills. So it is shorter, 2 hours. And instead of being 16 weeks straight, we actually made it 2 8-week components with a break in between, because our participants talked about, even though the program is super long, they felt like the program meetings are very long. They felt like it wasn't enough time in the program to really develop the skills they were wanting to develop. So we added in about a 6-week break in the middle to allow them to do some practice in between modules. We streamlined the topics in order to reduce the time. So during those acceptability surveys, we asked participants to rate the value of each of the topics we went over. And some of the ones that were rated lower by participants, we actually removed from the program, but we're keeping the content to use in potential individualized meetings. And then shortened the time spent on the mindfulness practice, which was actually quite a bit in the first 2 cohorts of the program. We delivered the revised program to the participants who were in our delayed treatment control group, and we're currently analyzing the feasibility and acceptability data from that. And we've also established an advisory board for future development of the program. So these are autistic adults who went through either peers or strengthening skills through this study, and they are currently helping us to interpret the findings and to make decisions about next steps for the program. So in summary, we still have a lot to learn about autistic adults of any age, but in particular, middle-aged and later-aged adults. There is a wide variety of outcomes in adulthood, but many autistic adults would benefit from additional supports, in particular in these areas that I have on the slide. And the Strengthening Skills program is one of the first, I think it actually is the first program for adults beyond the young adulthood period that is undergoing this empirical development and testing. We have some promising feasibility and acceptability, and in future studies, we will look at effectiveness of the program with larger sample sizes. So with that, I'm going to stop talking because it's been a lot, but I do want to let you know that you can learn about opportunities for research at SARC on our website. I've listed it here, and this is what it'll look like when you go to that page. It talks about all of our current research studies and opportunities.
Well, Dr. Matthews, thank you so much. I always learn so much, and it's great to know that there are studies being done, but that the studies are really about helping people now, helping the participants now. It's not just gathering the information and then, in 10 or 15 years, maybe it would help somebody in the future. So I think it's really great to have research studies that are going on that are useful today. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all that information with us.
Yeah, of course. Happy
And
to be here.
I loved your use of, how to get a new habit in place, regardless of what it is to tag it onto something that you're going to do anyway. So that becomes your new habit also. I love that.
It's beautiful and it's supported by science. It's an effective way to do it. So I encourage everyone to try it.
Yeah, I heard that, it takes 30 days to create a new habit. And I always think, but it's so hard to do something consistently for 30 days that's new. But Like you
That's
said, if
actually
you,
not true. Much
oh,
longer than 30 days. Yeah, it depends on the habit and how complex it is. But like something like adding a drink of water with your dinner can take more than 2 months to do consistently. So, and that's a really simple habit to develop. So don't get discouraged if it takes you some time, and anchoring it to something and, picking back up if you don't get it the first time is super helpful.
yeah, wonderful. Well, I don't see any questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I'm so thankful to have you. We're so honored and grateful that we have SARC in our community here in the greater Phoenix area. And thank you to our participants. And
Yes,
if
thank you,
anybody has
everyone.
if anybody has questions, Dr. Matthews' materials included contact information. And of course, you can always contact our office. And so we hope to see everybody at our next webinar next month. And until then, stay safe and all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.